Walter Jenkins had built his shed with his own two hands. It wasn't just any shed. It was a workshop, a sanctuary, a testament to his 30 years as a master carpenter. The cedar-sided structure stood proudly at the back corner of his property, its weathered wood blending harmoniously with the mature oak trees that dotted his backyard. He constructed it 5 years ago, shortly after retiring and moving to Pinnacle Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood that promised peaceful golden years. On a crisp Tuesday morning in October, Walter was in his kitchen brewing coffee when he noticed the white envelope protruding from his mailbox. Something about its official appearance made his stomach tighten. He retrieved it, recognizing the Pinnacle Homeowners Association letterhead immediately. Violation Notice. Unauthorized structure, the bold letters proclaim at the top of the page. Walter's weathered hands trembled slightly as he read further. According to the notice, his beloved workshop violated Covenant Section 7.32 regarding auxiliary structures. The HOA demanded he remove it within 30 days or face daily fines of $100. "This is ridiculous," Walter muttered, slamming the notice onto his kitchen counter. "The shed's been here for 5 years. Nobody said a word until now." He pulled out his reading glasses and scrutinized the signature at the bottom. Regina Harrington, HOA president. The same Regina Harrington who had unsuccessfully tried to buy Walter's corner lot last spring when she wanted to expand her adjacent property. Walter poured his coffee, his mind already calculating his options. He had attended exactly 2 HOA meetings since moving in, finding them tedious exercises in petty power. Regina had been elected president just 3 months ago, running unopposed on a platform of neighborhood beautification and property value protection. After breakfast, Walter threw on his jacket and walked the perimeter of his property. The shed sat 5 feet inside his property line. He'd made damn sure of that when building it. It was well-maintained, painted the same sage green as his house, with flower boxes under the windows that his late wife had insisted upon. "Mr. Jenkins." Walter turned to see his neighbor, Tom Whitaker, waving from across the fence. "Morning, Tom," Walter called back. "Heard about the HOA thing," Tom said, leaning against the fence. "Regina's on a tier. Sent violation notices to half the neighborhood this week. Swimming pools, playground equipment, garden gnomes, you name it. She can't just suddenly enforce rules that haven't been an issue for years," Walter protested. Tom shrugged. "New regime, new rules. Word is she's got big plans for Pinnacle. Wants to make it exclusive, whatever that means." Walter glanced back at his shed, memories washing over him. He'd built it the summer after Eleanor passed away, channeling his grief into every nail, every plank. Inside were her gardening tools, still arranged the way she liked them, and the workbench where he taught his grandson to build his first birdhouse. "I'm not taking it down," Walter said, his voice quiet but firm. "You'll have to fight the HOA then. They've got lawyers, you know." Walter nodded, an unfamiliar heat rising in his chest. At 68, he'd spent his life avoiding confrontation, following rules being the reasonable one. But something about this, the arbitrary enforcement, the thinly veiled power play, sparked a rebellion he hadn't felt since his youth. "Then I guess we're going to war," Walter said, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. That afternoon, Walter dug through his filing cabinet and found his original property documents, HOA covenant, and the county building codes. He spread them across his dining room table, armed himself with highlighters and sticky notes, and began plotting his defense. What he discovered made his blood boil. According to county records, his shed had been properly permitted. The HOA covenant was vague about auxiliary structures, mentioning size limitations but nothing that his shed violated. Most damning of all, he found minutes from an HOA meeting 3 years prior where his shed had been explicitly discussed and approved as grandfathered in. Walter Jenkins was not a man who angered easily, but as the autumn sun cast long shadows across his property, illuminating the workshop that held so many memories, a dangerous resolve took root in his heart. Regina Harrington and her HOA had picked the wrong shed and the wrong man. The next morning, Walter arrived at the Pinnacle Estates Community Center 15 minutes before the HOA office opened. He carried a manila folder containing his documentation, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and determination etched across his face. "We open at 9, snapped a voice as the door cracked open. Regina Harrington stood in the doorway, her professionally highlighted hair styled in an immaculate bob, a coffee cup emblazoned with Boss Lady clutched in her manicured hand. "I know what time you open," Walter replied evenly. "I'd like to discuss this violation notice." Regina's eyes narrowed slightly, but she stepped aside. "Fine. Come in." The HOA office was small but meticulously organized. Regina settled behind her desk, not offering Walter a seat. "Mrs. Harrington," Walter began, "I've received this notice about my shed, but there seems to be a misunderstanding." He placed his folder on her desk and opened it. I have the original permit from the county, and according to the HOA minutes from 3 years ago, my shed was specifically discussed and approved. Regina barely glanced at the documents. The board has revisited the covenant interpretations. Your shed exceeds the current aesthetic guidelines. Aesthetic guidelines? Walter repeated. That's not mentioned in the violation notice. And the covenant hasn't changed in the 5 years I've lived here. Interpretations evolve, Mr. Jenkins. Regina smiled thinly. Pinecrest Estates is an upscale community, and the board is committed to maintaining certain standards. She paused, workshop doesn't align with our vision. Walter felt his pulse quicken. My workshop is well-maintained and matches my house. It's been there for 5 years without complaint. And now there is a complaint, Regina said, her tone clipped. Several, actually. May I ask who complained? That's confidential information. Walter leaned forward. Regina, let's be honest here. This started after I declined your offer to buy my lot. Is this personal? Regina's smile vanished. That's an inappropriate accusation, Mr. Jenkins. The violation stands 30 days. As Walter left the community center, he noticed several neighbors gathered in small clusters, talking in hushed tones. One of them, Diane Peterson, waved him over. Any luck with the dragon lady? She asked. Walter shook his head. She wouldn't even look at my documentation. Staying with my fountain, sighed Diane. Apparently, it's now an unauthorized water feature after 6 years. By afternoon, Walter had spoken with 12 neighbors, all with similar stories. Regina's renovation plans for the community apparently involved purging anything that didn't fit her vision, regardless of previous approvals or common sense. That evening, Walter's doorbell rang. Tom Whittaker stood on his porch with a 6-pack of beer and a grim expression. Thought you could use this, Tom said. Heard Regina shot you down. The two men settled on Walter's back patio, the workshop visible in the golden evening light. She's targeting anyone who doesn't fit her idea of what this neighborhood should be, Walter said, taking a long sip of his beer. It's not just about property values. It's about control. Tom nodded. She's gunning for those 2 houses on Elm that haven't been updated since the 90s. Word is she's got developer friends interested in revitalizing parts of Pinecrest. That's not what most of us signed up for when we moved here, Walter muttered. Some of us just want a quiet place to live out our days. So what's the plan? You paying the fines? Walter gazed at his workshop, remembering Eleanor's laugh when he'd installed those flower boxes she wanted. The building represented more than wood and nails. It was a physical manifestation of his life's work, his grief, his healing. I'm going to the board meeting next week, Walter said. I'll present my case formally. Make them vote on record. And if they vote against you? Walter's jaw tightened. Then I'll get a lawyer. The following week, Walter stood before the 7-member HOA board in the crowded community center. Nearly 40 residents had shown up in unprecedented attendance for a monthly meeting. Mr. Jenkins, Regina said from her position at the center of the board table, you have 3 minutes to address your violation. Walter stepped forward, his documentation in hand. He spoke clearly, methodically laying out the history of his workshop, its compliance with county code, and its previous approval by the HOA. He quoted sections of the covenant that his shed did not violate and presented photographs showing its well-maintained condition. This structure has stood for 5 years without issue. Walter concluded, it is permitted, it is maintained, and it complies with all substantive requirements. I request that the board rescind this violation notice. Regina's expression remained impassive. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Does anyone on the board have questions? Silence. Then I move we uphold the violation notice. All in favor? 4 hands raised immediately, Regina and her 3 closest allies on the board. 2 members hesitated, looking uncomfortable, but eventually raised their hands as well. Only one board member, an elderly woman named Ruth, kept her hand firmly in her lap. The motion passes 6-1, Regina announced, not even attempting to hide her satisfaction. The violation stands, Mr. Jenkins, 30 days from the original notice. The room erupted in murmurs as Walter gathered his papers. This is ridiculous, someone shouted from the back. What about my gazebo? Called another voice. Regina rapped her gavel sharply. We will proceed with the agenda. Next item. But Walter wasn't listening anymore. As he made his way to the exit, neighbors patted his shoulder, whispered encouragements, slipped him their phone numbers. What had begun as his personal battle had clearly struck a nerve in the community. Outside in the parking lot, Ruth, the dissenting board member, approached him. This isn't right, she said quietly. Regina's been planning this for months. She's got 3 properties she wants to acquire, including yours. The aesthetic guidelines she keeps referencing don't even exist in any official capacity. Walter nodded grimly. Thank you for telling me, and for your vote. It won't stop with your shed, Ruth warned. She's just getting started. As Walter drove home, his mind raced with possibilities. You follow the proper channels, hire a lawyer, maybe file a complaint with the county. But as he pulled into his driveway and saw his workshop silhouetted against the setting sun, a more radical thought flickered through his mind. If Regina Harrington wanted a war, maybe it was time to give her one she wouldn't forget. Walter spent the next week consulting with 3 different attorneys. Each consultation left him more frustrated than the last. Can they do this? Walter had asked the first lawyer, a young woman with sympathetic eyes. Legally, it's complicated, she replied. HOAs have broad enforcement powers. Even if the rule wasn't enforced before, courts often side with the right to begin enforcement at any time. The second attorney had been more blunt. You're looking at $5,000 to $10,000 in legal fees minimum. No guarantee of winning. The third, an older man who specialized in property disputes, offered the most sobering assessment. The practical reality is that HOAs usually win these fights, Mr. Jenkins. They have deeper pockets and can outlast most homeowners in court. Even with your documentation, they'll argue changed circumstances, community standards, any number of technical defenses. As the deadline approached, Walter's neighbors rallied around him. They organized an emergency community meeting at the local library, neutral territory away from Regina's influence. Nearly 50 residents attended, a quarter of the neighborhood. This isn't just about Walter's shed, Tom Whittaker declared to the assembled group. Today it's his workshop, tomorrow it's your fence, your paint color, your flower beds. Regina's using the HOA to reshape Pinnacrist according to her vision, not ours. Diane Peterson stood up, clutching a folder. I've done some digging. Regina's brother-in-law owns Midstate Development. They've been buying up properties in communities like ours, making cosmetic upgrades and flipping them at premium prices. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Walter listened, his expression growing darker by the minute. We could try to recall the board, someone suggested. The bylaws require a 60% vote from all homeowners, Ruth, the dissenting board member, explained. And you know how hard it is to get people to vote. What about a petition? Another voice called out. The discussion continued, but Walter found his attention drifting. Through the library window, he could see a slice of the neighborhood. Tidy homes with manicured lawns, each one representing someone's dream, someone's sanctuary, including his own. 23 days after receiving the violation notice, Walter woke before dawn. He made his coffee and walked out to his workshop in the pale morning light. Inside, he ran his hand over the workbench, remembering the countless hours spent here, the peace he found in shaping wood with his hands. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom. Any word from the lawyer? Walter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a small photo album. Inside were pictures of Eleanor working in her garden, of his grandson proudly holding up the birdhouse they'd built together, of Walter himself on the day he finished the workshop, his face tired but proud. When he finally replied to Tom, his message was brief, taking care of it today. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Walter arrived at the HOA office. Regina glanced up from her desk, clearly annoyed by his presence. Mr. Jenkins, the board's decision is final. Unless you're here to inform me that you'll be removing your shed, we have nothing to discuss. Walter set a thick envelope on her desk. I've had this workshop assessed. It's worth approximately $8,000 in materials and labor. The fine you're threatening is $100 per day, which would exceed the value of the structure in less than 3 months. Regina smiled thinly. I'm glad you're beginning to see reason. I'm not taking it down, Walter said calmly, and I'm not paying your fines. Her smile faltered. Then we'll place a line on your property. You're welcome to try. Walter slid the envelope closer to her. Inside is documentation from my attorney regarding the improper procedure of your violation notice, the conflict of interest in your position, even your prior attempt to purchase my property, and copies of emails between your brother-in-law and 3 real estate agencies discussing plans for redevelopment opportunities in Pinnacrist Estates. Regina's face drained of color. Where did you get those? Does it matter? Walter's voice remained steady. Also included is a draft complaint to be filed with the County Ethics Commission regarding HOA financial irregularities uncovered during our investigation. Ruth was quite helpful. Regina stood abruptly. This is blackmail. This is negotiation, Walter corrected her. I've lived by the rules my entire life, Regina. I've respected authority, followed procedure, been the reasonable one. But I've learned something important recently. He leaned forward slightly. Sometimes reasonable people get steamrolled by unreasonable ones who count on that reasonableness. What do you want? Regina hissed. Simple. A formal rescission of all violation notices issued under your presidency. A special board meeting to review and clarify the covenant enforcement procedures. And your resignation effective immediately. Regina's laugh was brittle. Or what? You'll file a complaint that will take months to resolve, if ever. Walter checked his watch. Actually, I have a backup plan scheduled for noon today. I've invited Channel 4 News to do a human interest piece on HOA overreach in retirement communities. They seem particularly interested in your family connections to local development companies. Regina stared at him, calculating her options. "You'll have 3 hours," Walter said, turning to leave. "After that, this becomes public, very public." "The board won't stand for this," Regina called after him. Walter paused at the door. 47 homeowners signed a petition last night supporting a board recall. We only need 53 more. Once this story hits the local news, how many do you think will join them? The morning stretched endlessly as Walter sat in his kitchen, watching the clock. He played his hand. A careful blend of actual evidence, calculated bluffs, and the power of community pressure. Now was Regina's move. At 11:42 a.m., his phone rang. It was Ruth. "She's called an emergency board meeting," Ruth said, her voice tense with excitement. "Claims she needs to address community concerns immediately." Walter smiled for the first time in weeks. "Is she going to meet our terms?" "It looks that way," Ruth confirmed. "But Walter, be careful. Regina doesn't surrender easily." As Walter hung up, he stared out at his workshop, bathed in midday sun. The battle might be turning in his favor, but something told him the war was far from over. Regina Harrington wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. And neither, as it turned out, was Walter Jenkins. The emergency board meeting was held that evening at the community center. Walter arrived 15 minutes early to find the parking lot already full and a crowd of neighbors gathered outside, buzzing with anticipation. Tom Whittaker hurried over as Walter parked his car. "It's packed in there," Tom reported. Word spread like wildfire. "Regina looks like she swallowed a lemon." Inside, the meeting room was standing room only. Walter felt dozens of eyes on him as he made his way to an empty chair in the front row. Regina sat at the center of the board table, her face a mask of professional composure, but Walter could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged papers before her. At exactly 7 p.m., Regina called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice betraying none of the anger Walter knew she must be feeling. "Recent events have brought to light some concerns about our covenant enforcement procedures. The board has convened to address these concerns and ensure transparency in our operations." For the next 20 minutes, Regina outlined a proposal for a covenant review committee that would evaluate all outstanding violations and make recommendations to the board. She announced a 60-day moratorium on enforcement of all current violation notices pending further review. Walter listened carefully, noting what she wasn't saying. There was no mention of her resignation, no explicit rescission of the notices. Instead, she was buying time, recasting herself as a champion of fairness and procedure. When she finished speaking, Ruth immediately raised her hand. "Madam President, I believe we had discussed more concrete actions, including the immediate rescission of all violation notices issued in the past 3 months." Regina's smile was tight. "The moratorium effectively pauses enforcement, Ruth. The committee will determine which notices should be rescinded. And who will chair this committee?" Walter called out from his seat, not bothering to raise his hand. Regina's eyes locked with his. "The board will appoint the chair at our next regular meeting." A chorus of objections erupted from the crowd. Regina rapped her gavel sharply. "Order, please. This is still a formal board meeting." Walter stood up. "You're backpedaling, Regina. This morning we discussed specific terms, including your resignation. Now you're proposing a committee that you'll likely control with no guarantee of actual resolution." Regina's face hardened. "Mr. Jenkins, you're out of order. While I appreciate your concerns, I never agreed to resignation. That would be irresponsible to the community I was elected to serve. The community you're trying to reshape for your own benefit." Walter shot back. The room erupted again, this time with voices of support for Walter. Regina banged her gavel repeatedly, but the noise only grew. In the midst of the chaos, Walter's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced down to see a message from an unknown number. "Check your email. Now." Walter stepped outside to the relative quiet of the hallway and opened his email. The message had been sent just minutes ago from an anonymous account. The subject line read simply, "You should see this." The attached document was a scanned copy of a contract between Midstate Development and Parkview Residences, LLC. Walter skimmed it quickly, his blood running cold as he realized what he was looking at. The contract outlined plans for a luxury condominium development on the consolidated parcels currently designated as 42, 43, and 44 Pinehurst Lane. Walter's address was 43 Pinehurst Lane. The contract was dated 6 months ago, well before Regina had approached him about selling his property. Walter stared at the document, pieces falling into place. This wasn't just about his shed. Regina's attempts to buy his property, the Sutton violation notices, the targeting of specific homes. It was all part of a larger scheme. She wasn't just trying to enforce community standards, she was trying to force out homeowners who stood in the way of this development plan. When Walter returned to the meeting room, the argument was still raging. Regina was standing now, her composure cracking as she faced a room full of angry neighbors. The board has made its decision, she was saying. The moratorium and review committee are reasonable steps to address. They're delaying tactics, Walter interrupted, his voice cutting through the din. Every head turned toward him. And now I understand why. Walter held up his phone. I just received documentation of a development contract involving 3 properties on Pinehurst Lane, including mine. The contract is signed by Midstate Development, your brother-in-law's company, Regina, and dated 6 months ago. The room fell silent. You never approached me about buying my property because you wanted to expand yours, Walter continued, advancing toward the board table. You did it because you're part of a plan to demolish our homes and build luxury condos. Regina's face had gone pale. That's preposterous. I don't know what document you're looking at, but I forwarded it to everyone on the community email list, Walter cut in. I'm sure an investigative reporter would find it interesting as well. The room exploded once more, but this time Regina made no attempt to restore order. She gathered her papers with shaking hands and stood up. This meeting is adjourned, she announced, her voice barely audible above the uproar. As Regina tried to leave, she found her path blocked by outraged neighbors demanding explanations. Walter watched from a distance, feeling no satisfaction in her obvious distress. This wasn't just about his workshop anymore. Regina's scheming threatened people's homes or security their lives. Hours later, after the crowd had finally dispersed, Walter sat alone on his back patio, staring at his workshop in the moonlight. Tom had offered to come over, but Walter had declined. He needed time to think. His phone had been buzzing continuously with messages from neighbors, expressions of outrage, offers of support, questions about next steps. The community had rallied beyond anything he could have imagined. A recall petition was already circulating online, gathering signatures by the minute. Yet despite this apparent victory, Walter felt deeply uneasy. The revelation of the development contract had raised the stakes dramatically. Regina had been exposed, but she was just one player in a larger game. Midstate Development wouldn't simply abandon their plans because of a neighborhood uprising. As if confirming his fears, Walter's phone chimed with a new email notification. The sender was Regina Harrington. The message was brief. This isn't over, Mr. Jenkins. You've made a serious mistake. Walter deleted the email without replying. He knew threats when he saw them, and he recognized the desperate anger of someone whose carefully laid plans were unraveling. In the stillness of his backyard, Walter gazed at his workshop, the structure that had unwittingly become the catalyst for this neighborhood rebellion. He'd built it as a place of peace, a sanctuary for creation and memory. Now it stood as a symbol of resistance. They'll come after you next, he murmured to the silent building. And they won't use violation notices. Walter Jenkins had spent his life building things meant to last. Now for the first time, he found himself contemplating destruction. 3 days after the explosive board meeting, Walter awoke to the sound of an engine idling outside his house. When he peered through his bedroom curtains, he saw a black SUV parked across the street. The driver, a man in sunglasses and a dark suit, seemed to be watching his house. Walter dressed quickly and called Tom. I've got company, he said quietly. Someone's watching the house. I'm coming over, Tom replied without hesitation. By the time Tom arrived 20 minutes later, the SUV was gone, but Walter's unease remained. They sat in Walter's kitchen, coffee growing cold between them. Could be nothing, Tom offered. Maybe just someone waiting for someone else. Walter shook his head. He was taking photos of my house. I saw the camera. Over the next 2 days, the pattern continued. The SUV would appear for an hour or two, then disappear, only to return at unpredictable intervals. Other neighbors began to notice, reporting the same vehicle circling the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the community was in upheaval. Regina hadn't been seen since the meeting, calling in sick to her job at the local bank. 3 board members had already resigned, citing personal reasons. The recall petition had gathered nearly 200 signatures, more than enough to force a special election. But Walter took little comfort in these developments. Something darker was brewing. He could feel it. On the 5th morning, Walter found an envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a formal letter from Parkview Residences, LLC. Dear Mr. Jenkins, it began. We are writing to express our interest in purchasing your property at 43 Pinehurst Lane. Given recent community discord and the likely depreciation of property values in Pinehurst Estates, we are prepared to offer you a one-time opportunity to sell your home for 15% above current market value. The letter went on to detail the generous terms, a quick closing, no inspection contingencies, relocation assistance. It was signed by Richard Harrington, Regina's brother-in-law and CEO of Midstate Development. At the bottom, a handwritten note had been added. This offer expires in 72 hours. We strongly encourage you to accept. Walter read the letter 3 times, his carpenter's hands crinkling the expensive stationery. The generous offer was transparent for what it really was, a bribe wrapped in a threat. By noon, Walter had learned that the owners of 42 and 44 Pinehurst Lane had received identical letters. Mrs. Chen at number 42, a widow in her 70s, was distraught. The Ramirez family at number 44 was considering the offer, concerned about the mounting tensions in the neighborhood. Walter called an emergency meeting at his home that evening. 20 neighbors crowded into his living room, including Ruth from the board and several other homeowners who had received violation notices. "They're trying to divide us," Walter explained, passing around copies of the letter. "Pressure the most vulnerable, isolate the most stubborn. Can they force us to sell?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice quavering. "Not legally," Ruth assured her. "But they can make life very difficult." "They already are," Tom pointed out. "The surveillance, the harassment, the violation notices. It's intimidation, plain and simple." As the discussion continued, Walter found himself drifting to the window, staring out at his workshop. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across his yard. The building seemed to glow with an inner light, a beacon of resistance in the gathering dusk. A plan was beginning to form in Walter's mind, a radical plan, perhaps foolish, certainly risky. But the more he thought about it, the more inevitable it seemed. The next morning, Walter drove to the county records office. He spent hours poring over property documents, zoning regulations, and building codes. He then visited his bank, where he spent a lengthy time in consultation with a financial advisor. His final stop was at his lawyer's office, where he signed several documents and left specific instructions. When Walter returned home late that afternoon, the black SUV was parked directly in front of his house. This time, Walter walked straight to the vehicle and rapped on the driver's window. The window lowered to reveal a middle-aged man with a close-cropped beard and impassive eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Tell Richard Harrington I have a counteroffer," Walter said. "Meet me tomorrow at noon. My place." The man's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about." Walter leaned closer. "Cut the crap. We both know who you're working for. Noon tomorrow. Just Richard. No lawyers, no goons." He patted the car door. "And find a less obvious surveillance vehicle." That evening, Walter called Tom, Ruth, and several other neighbors who had become his closest allies in this fight. He explained his plan, answered their incredulous questions, and weathered their objections. "You're sure about this?" Tom asked finally. "There's no going back." "I haven't been sure about anything in years," Walter replied, "but I'm doing it anyway." The next day dawned clear and warm, a perfect November morning. Walter rose early and spent an hour in his workshop, running his hands over the tools he collected over a lifetime, breathing in the mingled scents of wood and oil and memories. At 11:30, neighbors began to gather along the street, keeping a respectful distance from Walter's property, but clearly there to witness whatever was about to unfold. Tom stationed himself on Walter's front porch, a silent sentinel. At precisely noon, a gleaming black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Richard Harrington stepped out, tall, expensively dressed, the same cold confidence Walter had seen in his sister-in-law. Regina emerged from the passenger side, her face tight with suppressed anger. "Mr. Jenkins," Richard called, approaching the front yard where Walter stood waiting. "I understand you want to discuss our offer." Walter nodded. "I have a counter-proposal." He led them around to the backyard where his workshop stood in the midday sun. For a moment, the three of them stared at the building in silence. "My workshop," Walter began, "has become something of a symbol in this neighborhood. Your sister-in-law wanted it gone because it didn't fit her vision. You want it gone because it stands on land you've already sold to developers." Richard's expression didn't change, but Regina shifted uncomfortably. "So I decided to give you both what you want," Walter continued. "The workshop will be gone by sunset today." "You're accepting our offer?" Richard asked, the faintest hint of triumph in his voice. Walter smiled grimly. "Not exactly." He handed Richard a thick envelope. "Inside you'll find documentation that I've placed my property in an irrevocable trust. The trust has a single condition. This land cannot be sold to any development company or its subsidiaries for 99 years. Regina gasped. Richard's composure finally cracked, his face darkening with rage. "You can't do that," he sputtered. "I already have," Walter replied calmly. "It's filed with the county as of yesterday. I've also used my retirement savings to establish a legal defense fund for any Pinecrest homeowner facing HOA harassment or predatory buyout attempts." Richard stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? We can make your life a living hell." Walter didn't flinch. "You've already tried. Now I'm showing you what hell looks like when it comes from the other direction." He glanced at his watch. "You might want to step back now. Both of you." Richard frowned, confused. "What are you?" Walter pulled a small remote control from his pocket. "You wanted my shed gone? Fine, but it goes on my terms, not yours." Before either of them could react, Walter pressed the button. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, with a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very earth, Walter's beloved workshop erupted in a blinding flash of light and heat. The explosion sent splintered wood and debris shooting skyward, the shockwave knocking Regina and Richard back several steps. As the smoke cleared and the echo of the blast rolled across the stunned neighborhood, all that remained of Walter's workshop was a smoldering crater in his backyard. Walter pocketed the detonator and turned to face the Harringtons, who stood frozen in shock and disbelief. "Consider your violation notice fulfilled," he said quietly.